The day Venezuela redrew the map and why no one noticed until it was too late. Let me take you back to January 9, 2024. That was the day Nicolas Maduro, in a televised address flanked by military officers and maps of the disputed Essequibo region, announced Venezuela's annexation of a territory roughly the size of Florida, one that Guyana, its tiny neighbor to the east, had controlled for over a century. The move didn't come out of nowhere, of course. For months, Maduro had been ratcheting up nationalist rhetoric, holding referendums, and even conducting military exercises near the border. But the timing? That was the masterstroke. At first glance, the mainstream narrative was Venezuela, desperate for economic relief and facing a collapsing oil industry, was lashing out to distract its population from domestic misery. The U.S. State Department condemned the move as provocative and illegal. The UK, Guyana's former colonial power, sent a warship to the region as a show of support. The media framed it as another chapter in the long, sad decline of a petrostate gone rogue. But here's the problem with that: it's not just incomplete, it's dangerously misleading. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And what I can tell you is that Venezuela's gambit wasn't just about oil, or even about Guyana. It was a carefully calibrated move in a much larger game, one where the rules are being rewritten in real time, and where the players are far more interested in the endgame than in the headlines. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's been sold to the public, goes something like Venezuela, under Maduro's authoritarian rule, is a failed state. Its economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. Millions have fled the country. And now, with U.S. sanctions crippling its oil exports, Maduro is turning to nationalism to rally his base. The Essequibo dispute, a long-simmering territorial conflict with Guyana, was the perfect distraction. A referendum in December 2023, widely dismissed as rigged, showed 95% support for annexing the region. Weeks later, Maduro announced the creation of a new Venezuelan state, Guayana Essequibo, complete with a governor and military presence. The international response was swift. The U.S. Southern Command conducted joint military exercises with Guyana. The UK deployed the HMS Trent, a patrol vessel, to the region. The UN Security Council held an emergency session, though Russia and China blocked any meaningful action. The media narrative: Maduro was a desperate dictator, clinging to power by manufacturing a crisis. Case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. It ignores 3 critical facts. First, the Essequibo isn't just any disputed territory. It's home to some of the largest oil discoveries in the world, over 11 billion barrels, according to ExxonMobil, which has been drilling there since 2015. Guyana's GDP grew by 62% in 2022 alone, the fastest in the world, thanks to these reserves. Venezuela, meanwhile, sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, yet its production has plummeted due to mismanagement and sanctions. If Maduro could seize even a fraction of Guyana's oil wealth, it would be a lifeline for his regime. Second, the timing of the move wasn't random. It came just weeks after the US and Venezuela had quietly resumed talks over sanctions relief. In October 2023, the Biden administration had eased some restrictions in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free and fair elections in 2024. But by January, those talks had stalled. Maduro's annexation gambit was, in part, a "you want to play hardball? Fine. But we have leverage too." Third, and most importantly, this wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about the shifting balance of power in the Western Hemisphere and the fact that Maduro had powerful backers who saw an opportunity. The hidden why January 9th was no accident. Let's start with the oil. The Essequibo isn't just valuable, it's strategic. Guyana's offshore fields are among the most lucrative in the world, and ExxonMobil, along with partners like Hess Corporation and China's CNOOC, has invested billions in developing them. Venezuela, by contrast, has been locked out of global energy markets by U.S. sanctions. But here's those sanctions don't apply to Russian or Chinese commies. And guess who's been quietly helping Venezuela develop its own offshore fields? Rosneft and CNPC. In 2020, Russia's Rosneft took over operations at Venezuela's largest oil refinery after U.S. sanctions forced American commies out. China, meanwhile, has been Venezuela's largest creditor for over a decade, loaning the country over $60 billion in exchange for oil shipments. When Maduro announced the annexation, he wasn't just making a play for Guyana's oil, he was signaling to Moscow and Beijing that Venezuela was still a player in the global energy game. But the real story isn't just about oil. It's about timing. January 2024 was a perfect storm for Maduro. The US was distracted by the war in Ukraine, by tensions with China over Taiwan, by a looming election that would dominate Washington's attention. The UK, Guyana's most vocal supporter, was in the midst of a political crisis of its own, with Rishi Sunak's government on the ropes. And in Latin America, the political winds were shifting. Leftist governments in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico had all signaled a willingness to engage with Maduro, despite his authoritarianism. The region was no longer a monolithic US sphere of influence. Then there's the China angle. In December 2023, just weeks before Maduro's announcement, China's Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, visited Caracas and pledged to strengthen strategic coordination with Venezuela. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America, investing in infrastructure, mining, and, crucially, military cooperation. Venezuela is a key node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, and Maduro's move in the Essequibo was, in part, a test of how far China would go to support him. Russia, too, had skin in the game. In 2022, Maduro had allowed Russian military aircraft to use Venezuelan airspace, and in 2023, Russia's deputy foreign minister visited Caracas to discuss deepening military technical cooperation. When Maduro announced the annexation, Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement calling for a peaceful resolution to the dispute, but notably, it did not condemn Venezuela's actions. That was no accident. Moscow sees Venezuela as a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a way to keep the US distracted and tied down in its own backyard. So let's Maduro, facing economic collapse and US pressure, makes a bold move to seize a resource-rich territory. The US and its allies condemn the action but take no meaningful steps to stop it. Meanwhile, Russia and China offer tacit support, seeing an opportunity to weaken American influence in the region. The timing isn't just convenient, it's strategic. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for a new world order. The great how Venezuela became a proxy battlefield. For decades, the Western Hemisphere was Washington's undisputed domain. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, declared that any European interference in the Americas would be seen as a threat to U.S. security. For most of the 20th century, that doctrine held. The U.S. toppled governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua. It invaded AMA and Grenada. It backed dictators and death squads when it suited its interests. And for the most part, the rest of the world stayed out. But the world has changed. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. China is the world's largest trading nation. Russia, despite its economic struggles, remains a nuclear-armed state with global ambitions. And in Latin America, a new generation of leaders, from Lula in Brazil to Petro in Colombia to López Obrador in Mexico, are no longer willing to accept U.S. hegemony without question. Venezuela's move in the Essequibo is a microcosm of this shift. It's not just about a territorial dispute. It's about spheres of influence. And it's about the slow, painful death of American unipolarity. Let me be, I'm not saying the US is powerless. Far from it. The US still has the world's largest economy, the most powerful military, and an unmatched network of alliances. But what we're seeing in Venezuela and in places like Ukraine, Taiwan, and the South China Sea is the erosion of that dominance. The US can no longer dictate outcomes. It has to negotiate them. And that's where the real danger lies. Because the US foreign policy establishment hasn't fully accepted this new reality. For decades, American strategy has been based on a simple we set the rules, and everyone else follows. But in a multipolar world, that premise no longer holds. And when the US tries to enforce its will in a region where its influence is waning, it risks overreach. Take the Essequibo crisis. The US could, in theory, intervene militarily to protect Guyana. It has the capability. But what would that achieve? It would turn Venezuela into a martyr for anti-American forces across Latin America. It would hand Russia and China a propaganda victory. And it would risk a wider conflict, one that could draw in other regional players, like Brazil or Colombia, who have no interest in being dragged into a US-Venezuela war. This is the trap of liberal hegemony. The US has spent the last 3 decades trying to remake the world in its image, only to find that the world is pushing back. And in that pushback, we're seeing the rise of a new kind of geopolitics, one where smaller states, like Venezuela, can play great powers off against each other. Maduro knows this. That's why his move in the Essequibo wasn't just about oil. It was about leverage. The military, why this could get ugly fast. Now, let's talk about the military side of this. Because while the US has been quick to condemn Venezuela's actions, the reality is that any direct military intervention would be a disaster. Venezuela's military is no match for the US in a conventional war. But that's not the point is that Venezuela doesn't need to win a war, it just needs to make it costly for the US to intervene. Here's how that could play out. First, Venezuela has been quietly modernizing its military with Russian and Chinese help. In 2020, Russia delivered a shipment of S-300 air defense systems to Venezuela, along with anti-ship missiles and advanced radar. China, meanwhile, has sold Venezuela drones, armored vehicles, and even a satellite surveillance system. These aren't game changers, but they're enough to make any US intervention more complicated. Second, Venezuela has been preparing for asymmetric warfare. In 2021, Maduro announced the creation of a new territorial defense force, modeled after Iran's Revolutionary Guards. The idea is to create a network of irregular fighters who could harass US forces in the event of an invasion. This isn't just rhetoric. Venezuela has been training these forces for years, with help from Cuban and Iranian advisors. Third, and most importantly, Venezuela has allies. Russia has already signaled that it would support Venezuela in any conflict with the US. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela as a show of force. In 2023, it conducted joint naval exercises with the Venezuelan Navy. And in January 2024, just days after Maduro's annexation announcement, Russia's foreign minister warned the US against destabilizing actions in the region. China, too, has a stake in Venezuela's survival. Beijing has invested billions in Venezuela's oil industry, and it sees the country as a key partner in its global energy strategy. While China is unlikely to intervene militarily, it could provide economic and diplomatic support to Venezuela in a crisis. So what does this mean for the US? It means that any military intervention in Venezuela would be a mess. Not just because of Venezuela's own defenses, but because of the risk of escalation. If the US were to strike Venezuelan targets, Russia could respond by increasing its support for Venezuela or even by opening a second front elsewhere, like in Cuba or Nicaragua. China, meanwhile, could use the crisis as an opportunity to deepen its ties with other Latin American countries, further eroding US influence in the region. This is the lesson of Iraq, Afghanistan, and military power is not the same as strategic power. The US can win battles, but it can't always win wars. And in a world where great powers are increasingly willing to challenge American dominance, the risks of overreach are higher than ever. The domestic why Biden can't afford to look weak. But here's the US isn't just facing pressure from abroad. It's also facing pressure from within. Joe Biden's administration is in a tough spot. The 2024 election is looming, and Biden is already facing criticism from both the left and the right. The left accuses him of being too hawkish, while the right accuses him of being too soft. And in this environment, any perceived weakness on Venezuela could be politically disastrous. Let's not Florida is a swing state, and it's home to a large Venezuelan exile community. These voters are fiercely anti-Maduro, and they've been pushing the Biden administration to take a harder line. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just over 370,000 votes. The Venezuelan American vote could be decisive in 2024. So what does that mean for Biden? It means he's under pressure to do something, but he also knows that military intervention is a non-starter. That's why the administration has been walking a condemning Venezuela's actions, but stopping short of any direct confrontation. This is the domestic political trap. The U.S. foreign policy establishment wants to maintain its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, but it's constrained by domestic politics, by the risk of escalation, and by the reality of a multipolar world. And that's why Venezuela's move was so carefully timed. Maduro knew that the U.S. was distracted, that its allies were divided, and that its domestic politics made a strong response unlikely. He wasn't just gambling on oil, he was gambling on American paralysis. How this could play out. So where do we go from here? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the US and its allies managed to de-escalate the crisis through diplomacy. The UN or the Organization of American States brokers a deal where Venezuela agrees to stand down in exchange for sanctions relief and a seat at the table in future oil negotiations. Guyana gets to keep its territory, but Venezuela gains some economic concessions. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely, given Maduro's intransigence and the US's reluctance to reward his aggression. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. Venezuela maintains its claim to the Essequibo but stops short of a full-scale invasion. The US and its allies provide military support to Guyana, but no direct confrontation occurs. The dispute becomes a frozen conflict, like Crimea or Kashmir, where the status quo is maintained but the underlying tensions remain. This is the scenario where everyone saves face, but it's also the one where the risk of future escalation remains high. Scenario 3, the escalation spiral. In this scenario, Venezuela makes a limited military move, perhaps seizing a small part of the Essequibo or harassing Guyanese oil ships. The US responds with airstrikes or a naval blockade. Russia and China increase their support for Venezuela, leading to a wider regional crisis. This is the worst-case scenario, and while it's unlikely, it's not impossible. The risk of miscalculation is high, and in a multipolar world, even small conflicts can spiral out of control. None of these scenarios are good. But the most dangerous thing we could do right now is assume that this is just about Venezuela. Because it's not. It's about the future of American power. And if we don't start thinking strategically, we're going to keep getting outmaneuvered. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Let's take a step back. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just a local crisis, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. For the last 3 decades, the US has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony. The idea was the US would use its unmatched power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. It would maintain a global military presence, enforce international norms, and punish those who defied the rules. But here's the it hasn't worked. In the Middle East, the US spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives trying to build democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to see both countries descend into chaos. In Latin America, the US backed coups, supported dictators, and imposed sanctions, only to see anti-American sentiment grow. In Europe, NATO action meant to secure the continent has instead provoked Russia into a war in Ukraine. And now, in Venezuela, we're seeing the same pattern. The US has tried to isolate Maduro, but instead of collapsing, his regime has adapted. It's found new allies in Russia and China. It's used sanctions as a rallying cry for nationalism. And now, it's making bold moves to secure its survival. This is the failure of liberal hegemony. The US has assumed that its power is limitless, that its values are universal, and that its enemies will eventually bend to its will. But the world doesn't work that way. Power isn't a one-way street, and the harder the US pushes, the more its adversaries learn to push back. Venezuela is just the latest case study in this dynamic. What most people don't realize is that Maduro's move wasn't just about Essequibo, it was about testing the limits of American power at a moment when Washington is distracted, divided, and increasingly seen as a declining hegemon. Let me explain why this matters. In the broader military count, the US still maintains unparalleled global force projection, but its ability to deter adversaries in its own backyard is eroding. Consider that the US Southern Command, responsible for Latin America, has seen its budget shrink by nearly 40% in real terms since 2010. Meanwhile, Russia has extended its military footprint in the region, with regular naval deployments to Venezuela and Nicaragua, and China has deepened its economic and intelligence presence through initiatives like the Belt and Road. The Pentagon's 2023 posture statement acknowledged that China now has more diplomatic missions in Latin America than the US does. That's not just a symbolic shift, it's a strategic vulnerability. Now, what's particularly dangerous about the Essequibo crisis is how it exposes the gaps in US deterrence. The Biden administration's response so far has been diplomatic condemnations, vague threats of sanctions, and a show of naval force with the USS Burlington conducting exercises near Guyana. But here's the uncomfortable truth: none of that is likely to change Maduro's calculus. Why? Because the US has already played its strongest economic sanctions. And yet, Venezuela's oil production has rebounded to nearly 900,000 barrels per day, up from a low of 350,000 in 2020, thanks to Iranian and Chinese technical support. The regime has learned to live with sanctions, and in some cases, even profit from them. This is where the military implications get serious. If Maduro believes the US won't risk a direct confrontation either because of domestic political constraints or because its forces are stretched thin in Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific, he has every incentive to escalate. The next logical step isn't a full-scale invasion of Guyana, which would be a logistical nightmare for Venezuela's crumbling military. Instead, it's likely to be a series of hybrid cyber attacks on Guyana's energy infrastructure, sabotage of ExxonMobil's offshore platforms, or even the deployment of irregular forces under the guise of civilian militias. These are the kinds of asymmetric moves that Russia has perfected in Ukraine, and Venezuela has already shown it can play this game. In 2019, Maduro's regime allegedly used Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group to prop up its security forces. If history is any guide, we should expect more of the same. But here's where the US response gets even more complicated. Any direct military intervention in Venezuela would be a political and strategic disaster. The last time the US seriously considered regime change in Caracas was in 2019, when the Trump administration backed Juan Guaido's failed coup attempt. That effort collapsed not just because of Maduro's resilience, but because key US allies in the region, including Mexico, Argentina, and even Colombia, refused to back it. Fast forward to today, and the political landscape is even less favorable. Lula in Brazil has made it clear he won't support US military action, and Colombia's Petro has called for dialogue with Maduro. The US would be isolated, and any intervention would play right into the regime's narrative of Yankee imperialism. So what's the alternative? The US could double down on sanctions, but as we've seen, that only strengthens Maduro's grip on power by giving him an external enemy to rally against. It could try to arm Guyana, but that risks turning a territorial dispute into a regional arms race. Or it could pursue a diplomatic off-ramp, but that would require concessions like easing sanctions or recognizing Maduro's legitimacy that would be politically toxic in Washington. This is the bind the US finds itself in across the global South. The tools of liberal hegemony, sanctions, military threats, and democracy promotion no longer work as intended because the world has changed. The unipolar moment is over, and the US is no longer the only game in town. China and Russia are happy to step into the void, offering loans, weapons, and diplomatic cover to regimes like Venezuela's. And they're doing it without the moralizing lectures that often accompany US engagement. Now, I'm not suggesting the US should abandon its interests in Latin America. But it needs to recognize that its current approach is failing. The Essequibo crisis isn't just about a disputed border, it's about the future of US influence in a region that was once considered its backyard. If the US can't deter a weakened Venezuela, what does that say about its ability to counter China in the South China Sea or Russia in Eastern Europe? Here's the hard: the US is still the world's dominant military power. But power isn't just about aircraft carriers and nuclear arsenals. It's about credibility, deterrence, and the perception of resolve. Right now, Maduro is testing all three. And if the US doesn't respond in a way that reasserts its strategic relevance, we're going to see more crises like this, not just in Latin America, but around the world. Because in a multipolar system, weakness is provocative. And the US is starting to look weak. Here's the uncomfortable truth: Maduro's timing wasn't just about geopolitical opportunism. It was also a calculated domestic maneuver, one that reveals just how fragile his regime really is. Most Western analysts focus on the external dimensions of the Essequibo crisis, the US response, the OAS condemnations, the Chinese and Russian backing, but they miss the internal chessboard. And that's where the real story lies. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, but not in the way most people think. Yes, hyperinflation has ravaged the bolivar, and yes, oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today. But the deeper crisis isn't economic, it's political. Maduro's support base has eroded to a hard core of about 20% of the population, according to recent polling by Dataanalysis. That's not enough to win a free election, but it's enough to survive if you control the military, the courts, and the electoral council. The problem? Even that 20% is fracturing. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's inner circle is deeply divided. On one side, you have the hardliners, figures like Diosdado Cabello, the former National Assembly president and head of the SUV's ideological wing, who still believe in the Chavista revolution's original anti-imperialist rhetoric. On the other, you have the pragmatists, men like Tarek El Ace Sami, the former vice president and oil minister, who understand that Venezuela's survival depends on reintegrating into the global economy, even if it means making concessions to the US or private creditors. These factions have been at each other's throats for years, but the Essequibo gambit was a way to paper over the cracks. Here's how it works. By escalating the border dispute, Maduro accomplished three things at once. First, he created a rally around the flag effect. Nothing unites a divided country like an external threat, and the Essequibo has been a nationalist cause in Venezuela since the 19th century. Even opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado, who has been a thorn in Maduro's side, had to tread carefully. She couldn't outright oppose the referendum without looking like a traitor. Second, he distracted from the December 3rd municipal elections, which were a disaster for the regime. The opposition, despite being fragmented and repressed, still managed to win key races in urban strongholds like Caracas and Maracaibo. That's a warning sign for 2024, when Venezuela is supposed to hold a presidential election. And third, he gave the military a reason to stay loyal. The armed forces have been the backbone of Chavismo since Hugo Chávez's 1992 coup attempt, but their support isn't unconditional. By framing the Essequibo as a matter of national sovereignty, Maduro reminded the generals that their interests are tied to his survival. But here's the catch: this strategy only works if the crisis remains contained. If Guyana calls Venezuela's bluff and the dispute escalates into actual conflict, Maduro risks overplaying his hand. The Venezuelan military is a shadow of what it was in the 1980s, when it was one of the most professional forces in Latin America. Today, it's plagued by corruption, desertions, and a lack of spare parts for its aging Russian and Chinese equipment. A prolonged standoff with Guyana, let alone a shooting war, could expose those weaknesses, and that's something Maduro can't afford. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because this is where the story gets even more interesting. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that the Venezuelan opposition is weak, divided, and incapable of posing a real threat to Maduro. That's only half true. The opposition is divided, yes, but it's not weak. The primary elections held in October 2023, which Machado won in a landslide with over 90% of the vote, proved that there's still a deep reservoir of anti-Chavista sentiment in the country. The problem isn't the opposition's popularity, it's the regime's ability to manipulate the rules of the game. Maduro knows he can't win a free and fair election, so he's doing everything he can to tilt the playing field. The Essequibo crisis is part of that effort. By keeping the country on a war footing, he creates an environment where normal politics, debates, campaigns, rallies become impossible. It's a classic authoritarian: if you can't win the game, change the rules. And if that fails, postpone the game altogether. Here's the scenario I'm watching closely. The regime has already signaled that it might delay the 2024 presidential election, using the Essequibo dispute as an excuse. They'll argue that holding an election during a national security crisis is irresponsible, and that the country needs unity, not division. That's a dangerous precedent, because once you start delaying elections, it's hard to stop. Look at Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega has turned elections into a farce. Or look at Russia, where Putin has used the war in Ukraine to justify crackdowns on dissent. Maduro is following the same playbook. But there's a twist. The opposition isn't sitting idly by. Machado has been touring the country, holding rallies despite government harassment. She's also been reaching out to international allies, including the US, to keep the pressure on Maduro. The Biden administration has been walking a tightrope. It wants to support democracy in Venezuela, but it also needs Maduro's cooperation on issues like migration and oil sanctions. That's why the US has been reluctant to fully reimpose the sanctions it lifted in October 2023 as part of a deal to allow free elections. But if Maduro continues to escalate the Essequibo crisis, that calculus could change. Here's what I think will happen in the next 6 months. Maduro will keep the Essequibo dispute simmering, using it to justify a crackdown on the opposition and a possible delay of the 2024 election. He'll also try to extract concessions from the US, like further sanctions relief, in exchange for de-escalation. The US, for its part, will likely play along, at least for now, because it doesn't want another crisis in its backyard. But if Maduro overreaches, if he tries to annex Essequibo outright or provokes a military confrontation with Guyana, the US will have no choice but to respond. And that's when things could get really messy. The wild card here is the military. If the generals start to believe that Maduro is leading them into a quagmire, they could turn on him. That's what happened in 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president and was briefly recognized by the US and dozens of other countries. The military didn't abandon Maduro then, but the situation is different now. The economy is in even worse shape, and the regime's legitimacy is more fragile than ever. If the opposition can convince key military figures that there's a path to a negotiated transition, one that guarantees their safety and their assets, they might be willing to switch sides. But let's be clear, this isn't a revolution in the making. Venezuela's opposition has been down this road before, and every time, the regime has outmaneuvered them. The difference this time is that Maduro is weaker than he's ever been. He's not Hugo Chavez, who could rally the masses with his charisma and his oil-funded social programs. Maduro is a survivor, not a visionary. And survivors make mistakes when they're desperate. The Essequibo crisis is a gamble, and like all gambles, it could backfire. If Maduro miscalculates, if he pushes too hard and provokes a response from Guyana or the US, he could find himself in a fight he can't win. But if he plays his cards right, if he uses the crisis to consolidate power and delay the election, he could buy himself another few years in office. And in the world of authoritarian survival, that's often all that matters. What this means for the US is that it needs to stop thinking of Venezuela as a problem to be solved and start thinking of it as a reality to be managed. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change, hasn't worked, and it's not going to work now. The US needs to engage with the opposition, yes, but it also needs to engage with the regime. That doesn't mean recognizing Maduro's legitimacy, it means recognizing that he's not going anywhere anytime soon, and that the only way to protect US interests in the region is to deal with him on pragmatic terms. The Essequibo crisis is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that in a multipolar world, the US can't just dictate outcomes. It has to negotiate them. And if it doesn't learn that lesson, it's going to keep losing ground, not just in Latin America, but everywhere. Because Maduro isn't the only leader watching how the US responds. So are Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and every other autocrat who sees weakness as an opportunity. And in geopolitics, opportunities don't stay open forever. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's timing isn't just about domestic politics, it's about the broader realignment of global power. The Essequibo gambit didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the same month that the US was distracted by a government shutdown, the same week that China and Brazil finalized a $7 billion currency swap deal to bypass the dollar, and just days after Russia announced it was exiting its military presence in Nicaragua. This isn't coincidence. It's choreography. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its backyard, assuming that economic pressure and occasional military posturing would keep regimes in line. But the world has changed. The dollar's dominance is no longer absolute, the US is overstretched in Ukraine and the Middle East, and China is quietly turning the region into a testing ground for its own version of soft power. Venezuela's move is a test case. If Maduro can get away with annexing territory without facing a serious U.S. response, it sends a message to every other leader in the rules have changed. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. foreign policy establishment still operates on the assumption that Latin America is a secondary theater. That's a mistake. The region is the front line of the new Cold War, not because of ideology, but because of geography and resources. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world. Guyana is now the fastest growing economy on the planet, thanks to ExxonMobil's offshore discoveries. And Brazil, under Lula, is playing both sides, courting China while keeping one foot in the Western camp. This is the new great game, and the US is losing because it's still fighting the last war. Take the 2019 Lima Group Declaration, where the US and its allies recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president. That was a strategic blunder. It boxed the US into a position where it had to either double down on a failed policy or admit defeat. Maduro outlasted it. And now, with the opposition fractured and the US distracted, he's rewriting the rules. The Essequibo referendum wasn't just about territory, it was about proving that he can defy the US and get away with it. So what are the alternatives? The first is to recognize that containment, not regime change, is the only realistic option. The US should stop pretending that Maduro is going to collapse under sanctions and start treating Venezuela like the regional power it is: flawed, corrupt, but durable. That means back-channel negotiations, not public ultimatums. It means offering sanctions relief in exchange for electoral guarantees, not demanding unconditional surrender. And it means working with Brazil and Colombia, not against them, to manage the crisis. The second alternative is to accept that the US can't do this alone. The days of unilateral intervention are over. If the US wants to counter China's influence in the region, it needs to offer Latin American countries something better than moralizing lectures about democracy. That means investment, not just aid. It means trade deals that don't come with strings attached. And it means respecting sovereignty, even when it's inconvenient. The third alternative is that the US needs to stop seeing Latin America as a client region and start seeing it as a partner. That's a cultural shift as much as a strategic one. For too long, Washington has treated the region like a problem to be managed, not a player to be engaged. But the rise of Brazil, Mexico, and even smaller nations like Guyana shows that Latin America is no longer content to be a passive observer in global affairs. The US can either adapt or get left behind. Now, let's talk about grand strategy. The Essequibo crisis is a microcosm of a larger the fragmentation of the post-Cold War order. The US is still the world's dominant power, but its ability to shape events unilaterally is eroding. China and Russia are filling the vacuum, not by building empires, but by offering alternatives: trade, investment, security partnerships that don't come with Western conditions. Venezuela's move is a perfect example. Maduro isn't a Chinese puppet, but he knows that Beijing will back him as long as it serves its interests. And right now, those interests: China gets access to Venezuela's oil, and Venezuela gets a lifeline that the US won't provide. The question for the US is whether it can compete in this new environment. The answer isn't more sanctions or more rhetoric about democracy. It's about offering a better deal. That means rethinking the Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century, not as a tool of domination, but as a framework for cooperation. It means accepting that the US can't dictate outcomes, but it can influence them by being a reliable partner, not a fickle hegemon. Here's the bottom: Maduro's move was carefully timed because he understands something that Washington still doesn't. In a multipolar world, weakness is provocative. The US can't afford to be distracted or indecisive. If it wants to maintain its influence in Latin America, it needs to act like a great power, not a declining one. That means making hard choices, not wishful ones. It means engaging with adversaries, not just allies. And it means recognizing that the rules of the game have changed, and if the US doesn't adapt, someone else will write them. The Essequibo crisis is a warning. The next one might not be.